She thought she was in charge and that no one could challenge her. But when a flight attendant hit a crying toddler in the middle of the flight, she had no idea that the boy's father owned the whole airline. Within minutes, the plane wasn't just landing, it was her career coming apart, and by the time she realized who she had hurt, it was too late. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn. Set up notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane was cruising along at 35,000 feet, and the cabin was filled with the low hum of engines and quiet conversations. Most of the passengers had settled down in their seats, with some watching movies and others dozing off in the middle of the plane. Amir was holding her toddler and rocking him gently in her arms. Cairo, her 2-year-old son, whimpered softly and moved around uncomfortably, and she rubbed his back and said soothing things to him in hopes he would drift off to sleep. He wasn't screaming or throwing a tantrum, he was just restless like any child on a long flight. A senior flight attendant named Miss Whitmore, with neatly pinned blonde hair and a stiff, sharp posture, stood near the galley and looked around the cabin. She had worked these flights for years and was proud of how well she kept order. First class was supposed to be a place of peace and quiet where well-behaved passengers could sit without being bothered. Her eyes fell on the child who was fidgeting and whining, which annoyed her. She sighed and smoothed down her uniform before taking a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way. She walked up to them, stalked next to their row, and folded her arms while looking down at a mirror with a tight smile that barely covered her anger. "Ma'am, you need to keep him quiet. The other passengers are trying to relax," she said in a firm but not too loud voice that drew attention. Amira looked up, her face tired but polite. "I'm trying," she said, adjusting Cairo in her lap. "He's just tired." Whitmore let out a small sigh, as if she had heard every excuse in the book. "Try harder," Amir muttered. Amir's lips parted, but before she could say anything, Cairo shifted again, and the child's small foot lightly touched Miss Whitmore's skirt. It wasn't a kick, just a harmless movement that was noticed. The woman stiffened as if she had been personally offended, and without giving it a second thought, she reached down, grabbed the child's tiny wrist, and smacked his hand hard enough that she snapped it. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Cairo flinch, and Amir freeze in shock, staring at Miss Whitmore with wide eyes. People on the plane were stunned into silence for a moment. No one spoke. Amir's grip on her son tightened as she pulled him closer, her heart pounding. Whitmore, who didn't seem to be affected, straightened up and smoothed down her uniform as if nothing had happened. "Teach your child some discipline," she whispered under her breath as she turned on her heel and walked back up the aisle without another glance. A few people looked at each other uncomfortably, but no one said a word. Some turned their attention back too. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Amira, who was still frozen, felt a rush of anger and disbelief wash over her. Her son had only been restless, he wasn't acting up, yet a stranger, someone who was supposed to be in charge of passenger comfort, had just touched him. She took a slow, shaky breath, trying to calm down. She wanted to speak up to demand an explanation, but before she could, a voice from 2 rows ahead cut through the tension. "What did you just do?" People on the plane turned their heads to look at the man who had spoken. Zayden Gray had been quiet the whole flight, sitting with a business magazine in his lap, but now his sharp eyes were fixed on Miss Whitmore. She barely even looked away, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were just fixing a small problem. Zayden didn't react right away. He took his time setting down his magazine, unbuckling his seat belt, and standing up. Miss Whitmore still wasn't moving. When she finally turned around and saw his face, the color left her face. Passengers whispered to each other, "It's him. It's the odor." One man muttered under his breath, That's him. That's the odor. Miss Whitmore's throat went dry. Her mind raced. She couldn't have seen the first-class list. She had checked the names and he wasn't there. He had to be a regular passenger, but she couldn't have been mistaken for anyone else. Zayden took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. You put your hands on my son, and with that, the whole flight changed. Those 7 words hung in the air like a storm, building tension in the cabin as people held their breath and wondered what would happen next. Miss Whitmore's eyes flickered with fear, but she quickly straightened her back as if she still had control of the situation. "Sir, I assure you there was no harm intended," she said, her voice quieter and less sharp than usual. "I was simply..." Addressing a disturbance, Zayden cut her off by stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was something controlled and dangerous in it. "You just hit a child, my child." Amir's heart raced as she turned to look at Zayden, finally realizing how big of a deal he was. She knew her husband was a successful businessman, but he never showed off his money or fame. Instead, he liked to fly like everyone else, to understand what his customers went through. But now that he was standing there, she realized. As he stood in the middle of the aisle and commanded the whole cabin, there was no mistaking the authority he carried. Miss Whitmore's throat bogged as she swallowed hard. The change in energy had happened so quickly. 1 minute she was enforcing rules and staying in charge, and the next she was stuck in a situation she couldn't get out of. "I understand your concern, Mr." She trailed off, acting like she didn't know his name. Zion's gaze didn't waver, and that single name sent another wave of murmurs through the cabin. Nearby man whispered to his wife, "That's Zayden Gray. He owns this airline." Miss Whitmore's fingers twitched at her sides, and her lips parted slightly as she realized that he wasn't just a board member. He was the CEO, the man at the very top, the man who could decide her whole future with one phone call. Passengers were now fully aware of what was happening. They weren't pretending to ignore it anymore. Some quietly pulled out their phones and checked the airline's website, making sure it was real. As they tried to regain control, Ms. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't realize, sir. Had I known that shouldn't matter," she said. Amir's voice came through quieter than Zayden's, but it was filled with just as much authority. "You don't get to decide who deserves kindness. You don't get to touch someone's child just because you think they don't belong here." Ms. Whitmore flinched as the words hit her mark. Her eyes darted around the room looking for support. The other flight attendants stood frozen in the galley, not sure if stepping in would make things better or worse. Zayden slowly let out a breath, pinching the bridge of his nose as if he were trying not to say something he'd regret. Without saying a word, he turned his head toward the front of the plane and locked eyes with one of the other attendants. "Get me the captain," he said, and Whitmore's whole world fell apart. There was a nervous silence. The request for the captain wasn't loud, but it was strong. People looked at Miss Whitmore, some moving their seats and others staring at her to see what she would say. The color had gone from her face, but she stood there frozen, as if hoping the moment would pass. It didn't. One of the younger flight attendants, Noelle, hesitated before stepping forward. She looked at Ms. Whitmore briefly, and then at Zayden without saying a word. She nodded and hurried toward the front of the plane. The tension rose, and Ms. Whitmore opened her mouth. She quickly said, "Sir, I don't think we need to escalate this. This was just a misunderstanding." Zion looked at her sharply and said, "You think this is a misunderstanding?" His voice was now softer, but it still had an edge that made her flinch. "You put your hands on a child who did nothing wrong. You humiliated my wife in front of a whole cabin, and now you're trying to talk your way out of it." Miss Whitmore swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "I wasn't aware of his status." As she spoke, Zayden let out a dry, humorless laugh, and Amira tightened her grip on Cairo, who had calmed down but was still holding on to her. She had been watching in silence, letting Zayden take the lead, but now she spoke again, this time with a clear voice. You thought no one would care. You thought we wouldn't matter. Ms. Whitmore didn't say anything because she didn't have an answer, but the soft click of a door opened made everyone look. Captain Reed, a man in his late 40s, with neatly combed brown hair and a calm air of authority, walked into the cabin. He took one look at the tense space, first looking at Zayden and then at Ms. Whitmore, who had become stiff. "What's going on here?" he asked in a calm voice, with a hint of urgency in his tone. Zayden turned to face him, his face tight with anger. "Your lead flight attendant thought it was okay to put her hands on my child," Zayden said. He looked at Miss Whitmore and couldn't make out his face. "Is that true?" he asked. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line for the first time. She looked truly afraid. She had been with the airline for years and built a career she was proud of. She had never imagined making one mistake that could ruin everything in minutes. "I may have misjudged the situation," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a heavy silence, and then Zayden slowly exhaled and shook his head. "That's the best you can do, Captain Reed." Mr. Gray straightened up and said, "I promise this will be handled properly." He then turned to Noel and said, "Get me a direct line to operations." Noel nodded and disappeared back into the cockpit. Whitmore's hands were shaking slightly at her sides. She knew she had lost control of the situation, but what scared her the most was that the worst was yet to come. The cabin was eerily quiet, with the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm about to break. Whitmore stood stiff, her fingers twitching as Captain Reed gave the order. Noel had already got into the cockpit, and Zayden, with his arms crossed over his chest, didn't bother to look at her anymore. His attention was now on Amira and Cairo, with his hand resting protectively on the toddler's back. Ms. Whitmore opened her mouth to try to defend her position, but Captain I cut her off with a hand gesture, and his tone made it clear that she couldn't argue. He turned to Zayden and said, "Mr. Gray, I understand this is unacceptable. I need to know what you want to do about it." Take Miss Whitmore's breath away. Her heart was racing as she realized she had lost all control. What happened next was now up to the man she had just harmed. Zayden didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath and tapped his fingers on his forearm as he thought. The silence stretched out for a long time, making Miss Whitmore's nerves fray with each passing second. Finally, he spoke. "Sir," she whispered, "my stomach is turning. I've worked for this airline for years and you threw it all away," Amir said coldly, her voice cutting through the flight attendant's weak plea. "Don't hurt my son and ask for sympathy." The cockpit door opened again, and Noel came back and holding out the in-flight phone. The captain answered, "Captain," and Reed took the receiver. He turned a little to listen to the voice on the other end, but Miss Whitmore couldn't hear what was being said because her heart was beating so fast. Some passengers still pretended not to notice by moving around in their seats, but others were fully involved, their eyes darting between Zayden Amira and the terrified flight attendant who used to carry herself with such authority. Captain Reed finally turned back and put down the phone. His face was blank, but the way he squared his shoulders made it clear that he had made a decision. He told Whitmore, equally, "You are relieved of duty as of today." As soon as someone gasped, Ms. Whitmore stumbled back a step and said, "No, you can't." Zayden raised an eyebrow and said, "I just did." Captain Reed nodded and said, "You will remain seated in the crew area until we land. Upon arrival, you will be escorted off the aircraft for a full review." Ms. Whitmore's humiliation was unbearable. She had been the one getting orders and making the rules, and now she was the one being thrown off like a UNR passenger. She turned around as if looking for someone to defend her. Flight attendants avoided her gaze. They had seen the whole thing and didn't want to be linked to her downfall. The captain's voice brought her back to reality. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sit down," she said, taking a shaky step back and settling into the nearest crew seat, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Her mind was racing. Zayden slowly let out a breath while adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. "Now that we've taken care of that," he said, looking at Captain Reed, "I expect a full incident report by the time we leave." Miss Whitmore's nightmare wasn't over, it had just begun. The plane's steady hum filled the cabin, but the mood had changed completely. People who had been watching the fight quickly turned back to their screens or looked out the windows as if they hadn't seen the flight attendant, who used to be very authoritative, fall. Others stole glances at Miss Whitmore, whose face was pale as she sat stiffly in the crew seat and stared at nothing. Zayden took her. His arm around Amir and Cairo, his son still tucked against his mother's chest, had finally started to ease the tension that had been building up. Amir's shoulders relaxed, but her fingers were still lightly tracing circles on Cairo's back. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or still shocked at how quickly things had gotten worse. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Amir and Zayden looked up and saw Noelle, the younger flight attendant, standing next to them. She had her hands clasped in front of her. Approached cautiously, wondering if she was going too far, but she felt compelled to speak. "I just wanted to say," she said in a voice just above a whisper, "what happened back there wasn't right. I was uncomfortable when I saw it, and I should have spoken up sooner." She looked at Amira with quiet regret and said, "I'm really sorry for what you went through." Amira looked into the woman's eyes for a moment and saw genuine regret in them. Zayden nodded. "It's not your fault, but you saw what happened. It wasn't just my son making noise, did you?" Noelle's face tightened as he said, "Yes, sir." Amir took a slow breath and her voice became calmer. "Promise me this. If you ever see something like this again, don't wait for someone else to speak up," she said. "I won't." A few feet away, Miss Whitmore stiffened at the exchange, but didn't dare speak up. Her role in the cabin had changed. She was no longer in charge or the one enforcing rules. She was now just another passenger waiting to see what the future held. The intercom voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting our descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and tables are in the upright position. Flight attendants will be making their final cabin check shortly." Zayden moved slightly, tapping his fingers rhythmically against his knee. Amir noticed the subtle movement, which she had seen before. He was thinking about his next move, so she leaned toward him and asked, "What are you planning?" He turned his head to look her in the eyes, but his expression was impossible to read. "You'll see that." Miss Whitmore caught that last part, her heart racing. She thought the worst was over, that she would be silently let off the plane and get in time to explain herself to airline management, but something in Zayden's voice sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't over yet. The descent felt slower than usual, or maybe it was just the weight pressing down on Miss Whitmore's chest. Every second felt like an eternity as her mind raced through the possible outcomes. Would they fire her right away? She stole a look at Zayden to see what he was thinking, but he hadn't spared her another look. He was focused on Amira and Cairo, adjusting the toddler's blanket while talking to his wife in low tones. Whatever he had planned, it wasn't meant for her ears. People around them were quietly fastening their seatbelts, and some were sneaking looks toward the front of the plane, where Captain Reed was sitting stiffly in his seat waiting for the final instructions from air traffic control. The intercom went off again, telling the cabin crew to get ready for landing. Noelle and the other attendants moved through the aisles checking seatbelts and securing trays, but the energy felt different. No one looked at Miss Whitmore or acknowledged her. It was as if she had been erased from their team. The plane's landing gear rumbled beneath them as it began its final approach. Miss Whitmore let out a breath and pressed her palms against her lap to steady herself. Maybe she could talk to the airline executives before Zayden did. A sharp ding interrupted her thoughts as a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane and waited near the jet bridge. His stance was firm, and his face was blank. He wasn't here for a routine check. He was waiting for someone. Whitmore's heart rate went through the roof, and her fingers curled around the armrest. This was happening faster than she thought. The plane's wheels hit the ground with a smooth but heavy thud and rolled down the runway before slowly slowing as they reached the gate. An announcement came over the speakers: "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off." There was a pause, and then the captain spoke again, but this time his voice held something different. "Passengers, we thank you for choosing our airline and wish you a pleasant stay." The words sent a wave of whispers through the cabin, and Miss Whitmore's stomach twisted painfully. Some crew members, she didn't need to be told, that meant her hands shook as she unbuckled her seatbelt, and her breath was short. She had spent years walking through this terminal with her head held high, but now she would be leaving under very different circumstances, and what was even worse, she still didn't know what Zayden Gray had planned. The seatbelt sign went off with a soft chime, and the usual sounds of landing filled the cabin, people shifting in their seats, overhead bins clicking open, and the faint hum of people were getting ready to get off the plane, but there was an unsettling energy in the air that made it feel like people weren't just ready to leave, they were waiting for something. Miss Whitmore sat frozen in her seat, her hands clammy against her uniform. The security officer stood by the front exit, his eyes fixed on the cabin as if he had been given strict instructions. She knew better than to think this was just protocol. He was waiting for her. Zayden stayed in his seat, calm and unreadable, with one arm resting on the armrest. He wasn't in a hurry to leave, he had time, which made Whitmore's stomach turn even more. The first-class passengers were let out first, and many of them quickly glanced at the tense scene but didn't say anything. Some looked with judgment at Miss Whitmore, while others just turned away as if nothing was happening. One by one, the rows cleared, and finally Captain Reed stood, adjusted his uniform, and turned to Miss Whitmore. "You'll remain. Sit down until further notice," he said in a firm but kind voice, and Miss Whitmore could barely nod. Zayden finally got up and stood slowly and deliberately, adjusting his blazer as he reached for his carry-on. Amira stood next to him and gently lifted Cairo, who was half asleep on her shoulder. Noelle quickly stepped forward to help with their bags, but Zayden stopped her with a hand and said, "We've got it." Noelle stepped back and nodded. Miss Whitmore swallowed hard as she realized Zayden was about to leave. He decided to lead and let the airline handle the situation. Maybe she had a chance to explain herself and find a way to save face. He then turned to the security officer and said, "Please escort her." The officer nodded yes, sir, which sent a chill down Whitmore's spine. As a matter of course, someone addressed a man who had given a direct order as sir. Passengers who were still leaving slowed down or stopped near the jet bridge as they felt the shift in power and the weight of Zayden. He wasn't just a rich businessman complaining, he was in charge. Miss Whitmore's voice barely made it out. "Mr. Gray, please." Zayden turned his head slightly and gave her his full attention for the first time since she had been relieved of duty. She saw nothing in his expression, no anger, no triumph, and no sympathy, that scared her more than anything else. With one last look at Captain Reed, he spoke again, "Make sure she's held accountable." He got off the plane with Amira next to him and Cairo still soundly asleep in her arms. Whitmore let out a series of shallow gasps as the security guard finally approached her. Standing only a few inches away, he said, "Ma'am, you need to come with me." She didn't move right away. Instead, she clenched her fists and looked around, but there was no one left to help her or back her up. Noelle turned away, and Captain Reed let out a sigh of relief. She used to be in charge of making sure people followed the rules, but now she wasn't even a flight attendant. She slowly stood up, her legs shaking, and with every step she took toward the front of the plane, she knew this wasn't just the end of a flight, it was the end of everything. The walk to the exit felt longer than any flight Miss Whitmore had ever worked, and her normally competent stride was replaced with slow, uneasy steps as the security officer led her up the stairs of the other passengers. She kept her head down and her nails digging into her palms as she moved. If she could just make it past the jet bridge and the terminal, she might be able to figure out a way to fix this, but she knew in her heart that she couldn't. Zayden Gray had yelled, and he hadn't made a scene, but his silence had been more damning than any public outburst. He had watched the situation unfold with calm authority, and now she wasn't just facing company policy, she was facing him as she got off the plane and onto the jet bridge, where the cool, clean air of the airport hit her like a slap. Just outside the glass walls of the terminal, she saw people walking toward the baggage claim, some of whom were looking in her direction. The security officer stayed close, walking slowly, but he wasn't the person she was afraid of, it was the man waiting just past the gate. Zayden stood next to a row of sleek black chairs, talking quietly with a man in a tailored suit who was one of the airline's senior executives. The executive would nod his head every once in a while to what Zayden was saying. Amira was a few steps away adjusting Cairo's blanket while he slucked in her arms. Amira's face couldn't be read, and M. Whitmore's heart pounded faster. This wasn't a private matter anymore, the executive team was involved. The security officer motioned for her to stalk a few feet away, and she did. She had been praying that Zayden would just leave and let the airline handle things quietly, but the way he stood there calmly talking to someone high up told her he wasn't going to do that. He wasn't just making a complaint, he was making sure there were consequences. The executive looked at her with a sharp, unreadable gaze and said, "Miss Whitmore," in a clear voice. "Follow me," she hesitated, her heart racing. "Can I at least explain?" she asked, her voice weaker than she meant to be. Zayden finally turned to face her and asked, "Explain what?" She opened her mouth to defend herself, but couldn't find the words because she didn't want to hurt anyone. The child that she had been overwhelmed that she would never have done it if she had known who he was. It all sounded hollow to her. The executive adjusted his tie and said, "You will have a chance to give your statement during the formal review." For now, she was told to hand over her employee badge and credentials. She held her breath and said, "Yes," the executive replied. She felt a slow creeping whir as she realized how quickly this was happening. She had been on duty less than an hour ago, in charge of the first class. She had been in charge of the cabin for years, but now she wasn't even working there anymore. Her hand shook as she reached for the lanyard around her neck, fumbling with the clip. The ID badge had been with her for years, worn as a sign of status that she was part of the elite crew. She had trained new flight attendants, enforced rules, and thought she couldn't be harmed. Now she took it off of her uniform and put it in the executive's waiting hand. Passengers getting off the plane walked past her. Some were pretending not to watch, while others were sneaking glances as if they were seeing a scandal happen in real time. M. Whitmore's mouth felt dry, and she asked, "After this review?" She had to force herself to keep her voice steady as Zayden adjusted his cuffs and watched her without showing any sympathy. "That depends on how honest you are," the executive said, pointing to a pair of doors that led to the restricted employee areas. Miss Whitmore hesitated for only a second before forcing her legs to move. She stole one last look. Zayden had already turned his attention back to his wife and son because she wasn't worth his time anymore, and that realization hit her harder than anything else. Ms. Whitmore walked through the double doors with the executive and security officer on either side of her. The corridor was eerily quiet, with sterile white walls and polished floors stretching out in front of her like a path to nowhere. Every step felt heavier, and the sound of her heels hitting the floor echoed in the silence. She had been in charge of training new flight attendants and enforcing rules before, but this was different. Now she was being led, and the weight of it hit her like a rock. The executive, a tall man with graying hair and a sharp face, didn't say much as they walked. He introduced himself as Daniel Clark, one of the airline's senior directors, but there was no warmth in his tone or sign of reassurance. He wasn't here to comfort her, he was here to deal with a problem. Finally, they got to a conference room with glass walls near the operations office. Daniel pushed the door open and motioned for Miss Whitmore to take a seat. She hesitated, but eventually did as he said and sat down in an air chair. The room was simple, with only a long table, a few chairs, and a big screen on the wall. There were no decorations or comforting elements in the room, it was just business. Daniel sat across from her, placing her ID badge on the table between them. The security guard stood by the door with arms crossed for a moment. Then Daniel spoke up. "You've been with this airline for over a decade, haven't you?" Miss Whitmore quickly nodded, glad that the conversation was off to a good start. "Yes, I dedicated years to this company. That's what makes this situation even worse," Daniel said, leaning forward a bit. "You didn't just make a mistake, you showed blatant misconduct on a flight in front of dozens of passengers, and worst of all, you put your hands on the child of the airline owner." She stuttered, "I only meant to discipline him." Daniel leaned back and crossed his arms. "Who gave you that authority?" Miss Whitmore's lips parted, but she didn't say anything. "Let me make this clear," Daniel continued. "No flight attendant is ever allowed to physically discipline a passenger, least of all a child." "I just lost my patience," she whispered, her fingers tightening against the table's edge. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, as if they were. Then slowly turned his attention to the screen on the wall. With a click, the screen lit up, and she felt sick to her stomach. It was a security feed, and she watched in horror as the footage played, a silent but damning recording from the plane's in-cabin cameras. The angle was just right, capturing the exact moment. She was standing over Amir and Kyra, her face tense with anger, her hand quickly touching the toddler's tiny wrist, and the worst part, a mirror. Miss Whitmore's fingers curled into her lap as Daniel turned off the screen. "So what do you have to say now?" he asked. "It looks bad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I wasn't thinking clearly." "You weren't thinking at all," Daniel corrected her. Miss Whitmore's pulse raced as she whispered, "Please." She leaned forward and said, "I've given this airline my whole career. I know I made a mistake. But this isn't just a mistake." Daniel cut her off. "This is." Zion's words, "make sure she's held accountable," came back to Miss Whitmore in her mind. It wasn't just a threat, she was being held accountable, and it wasn't over yet. Daniel let out a sigh of relief and pushed his chair back a little. "Here's what's going to happen next," he said. "Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension, pending a full review." Miss Whitmore took a sharp breath and said, "Suspension, yes." Daniel's tone stayed neutral. "You will receive an official notice within 24 hours of formal meeting with the board. Your employment status will be decided at that time," she said, grabbing the table. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "Yes, but if you're looking for a guarantee that you'll keep your job, I wouldn't count on it," he said, shaking his head. Please, she whispered. I didn't mean. Daniel held up a hand. Save it. He nodded toward the security officer. Escort her out. Miss Whitmore's vision blurred as she stood there, the walls of the room closing in around her. She had spent years walking these. When she walked down the halls with her head held high, enforcing rules and keeping order, she felt like a criminal. She followed the security officer through the hallway, each step making her feel heavier than the last. Employees she had worked with for years walked by, some giving her knowing looks, and others pretending not to see her at all. She felt embarrassed and helpless by the time she got to the exit doors. It hit her that this wasn't just a bad day at work. This wasn't just an incident. It was over, and she had only herself to blame. The airport doors opened, and the cold air hit Miss Whitmore's skin like a slap. She hesitated at the threshold, blinking against the rush of reality. She was no longer an employee and wasn't in any official capacity. The security officer next to her didn't push her forward or hurry her along. He didn't need to. She knew she had to walk out on her own. For years, she had come out these very doors after long flights, feeling with the satisfaction of a job well done. She had walked out with her head held high and her uniform pressed. She had given crew members short nods as they left, but now she was walking out by herself. The security guard didn't say a word. He just stood at the entrance and watched as she took slow, uncertain steps toward the curb. A few workers near the terminal exit whispered to each other and gave her quick knowing looks. Word had spread. That's the thing about airports. News spread faster than on a plane. Miss Whitmore clenched her hands together. She was trying to hold back the storm in her chest. She had been someone respected and even feared here, but now she was just a former worker who crossed the wrong person. No, she caught herself, that wasn't the real mistake. The real mistake was her own actions. She could try to explain them away in any way she wanted, call it tiredness, a lapse in judgment, impatience, but it didn't change the fact that she had touched a child, the child of the most powerful man in the airline business. That's the thing about power. She had spent years using it to control passengers, keep order in her cabin, and demand respect, but power could be taken away just as easily as it was given, and now she had nothing. She reached into her pocket for her phone, shaking as she unlocked the screen. There were a lot of notifications, a missed call from an airline friend, a message from a coworker asking what happened, and, worst of all, a new email from Human Resources. Her stomach turned. Opened it with the subject Job Status Update from the airline HR department at 6:42 p.m. This email is to let you know that you are currently on unpaid suspension while the airline's executive board looks into your behavior on Flight 637. A formal hearing will be set up within the next 5 business days, and if you don't follow the investigation process, you will be fired right away. Also, please be aware that during this time, you are not allowed to access any airline websites. More information about the airline's HR department will be sent in a separate email. She stared at the words so intently that her knuckles turned white. Unpaid suspension pending review, formal hearing. She knew what that meant. They weren't reviewing anything. They were waiting for Zayden Gray's final decision. She had seen similar situations before involving flight attendants who made bad decisions and employees who were called in for meetings thinking they had a chance. They went to court to argue their case and then left without a job. There was a security guard with them. She had been on the other side of those conversations. She had been the one whispering about it in break rooms and watching from afar as someone's name was erased from the crew schedule, as if they had never worked there at all. Now she was the one in the spotlight. She lowered her phone and stared blankly ahead at the road. Airport traffic moved as it always did, with taxis picking up families and pilots arriving and departing. The airport was getting ready for another flight, but she was stuck. A strong gust of wind hit her and tore through her uniform, or what had been her uniform, It wasn't hers anymore. The badge, title, and power were all gone. She quickly thought of a way out. She could go to the review, write an apology to Zayden Gray, but would that even matter? Since the moment he turned away from her in the conference room, she had felt like he didn't care. He had already decided that the review was only a formality, and she wasn't going back from this. The thought of it made her dizzy. She had worked hard for 10 years, training on flights, managing passengers, and enforcing rules. She had given up sleep, vacations, and personal time to do this job, and in less than 10 minutes, it was all over. Her legs felt weak, and she turned to look around the terminal for someone who could help support a miracle, but her eyes fell on the last person I wanted to see Zayden Gray. He was standing next to a private car on the curb and talking with another executive. His posture was relaxed but authoritative, and he looked at his conversation partner. Amira was standing next to him, holding Cairo, who was still half asleep. The toddler was squished against his mother's shoulder, and his tiny fingers were gripping the fabric of her coat. Zayden wasn't even looking at her. She felt like she wasn't there. She wanted to scream and march up to him and demand that he see her and understand how much she had fit into the company, but she knew that wouldn't change anything. She saw Amira move a little and whisper something to her husband. Zayden nodded and gently touched Str Cairo's back before looking at the driver. The man opened the door and stepped aside as Amira and their son, Zayden, carefully slid into the car. Just before Zayden stepped inside, he stopped for a moment and looked toward the terminal. Miss Whitmore's breath caught in her throat. In that split second, Zayden stepped into the car and the door shut behind him. The black sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of traffic. He was gone, and she was left standing there in the cold, watching as the last pieces of the life she had built slipped right through her fingers. Ms. Whitmore stayed at the curb for a long time after the black sedan had disappeared into the flow of airport traffic. The cold air bit her skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind was racing with regret, fear, and shock over what had happened. She had walked onto that flight with authority. With control gone, she stood outside, without anything she had worked for, as if the last 10 years of her life had never happened. People kept coming and going from the terminal, going about their lives, while she stayed frozen. A group of flight attendants walked by, laughing about something one of them had said. Their clean uniforms were the same as the one she was wearing, but they still belonged in theirs. Her uniform didn't mean anything anymore. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and shook her fingers as she scrolled through her contacts. There had to be an executive she had worked under, a manager who owed her a favor, or someone who could pull strings before things got out of hand. She found the name James O'Connell and called him. James was a senior HR executive who she had worked with for years, and they had gone to training sessions together and even talked about policies over coffee during breaks. He always respected her and would listen when she pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear. Her heart was racing as she heard the first ring, then 2, then 3, and then click, Whitmore. She caught her breath as he cut her off. She said quickly, "Listen, I know you probably heard what happened." His voice was firm, professional, and far away. She needed to talk to him, but he cut her off, and this time his voice carried something even worse than disinterest, finality. "What does that mean?" There was a pause, and then the words that broke her hope, "Mr. Gray has already made his decision." She took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. Desperate, she asked, "I haven't even spoken to the board yet, how can he?" James sighed. "You don't understand, do you?" He spoke calmly, but there was something almost pitying in his voice. "You're not dealing with an internal complaint. This isn't about protocol or policy violations anymore. You embarrassed the wrong person." She gripped the phone even tighter and said, I haven't even had my review, and there won't be one. James continued, the board will formally terminate your contract in the next 24 hours, but that's just a technicality. The decision has already been made. She felt like the ground was breaking under her. You don't know what it's like to work for someone like Zayden Gray, James said, lowering his voice slightly. He doesn't scream, he doesn't threaten, he just. She shook her head and tried to breathe, but his tone was firm. There's nothing you can do, Miss Whitmore. There was a long pause between them, and then he said quietly, for what it's worth, I'd start thinking about what comes next. There was a beep, and the line went dead. Her hand fell to her side, and the phone fell to the ground with a soft clatter. She barely noticed how heavy the weight of what had just happened was crushing her. It wasn't just her job, her career, her life. Zayden Gray had ruined her reputation with one choice, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her legs hurt, and she stumbled toward a nearby bench, where she collapsed. Her mind was still racing, looking for anything that could fix this, but nothing came to her. She had spent years controlling situations like this as the one in charge, making the rules, and now she was the example for anyone who thought they were untouchable. She closed her eyes tight. As Miss Whitmore sat on the bench, the minutes blurred together. Her hands gripped the edge as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling over completely. The weight of the conversation with James still rang in her ears. There won't be one. The decision has already been made. She had spent years thinking she had power in the airline, that her position, experience, and reputation made her untouchable, but now it was all gone, and she was reduced to nothing. Passengers kept coming and going from the terminal, unaware of the storm raging inside her. A group of pilots walked by laughing about something, their neatly pressed uniforms a painful reminder of everything she had just lost. Nearby, a young flight attendant with a rolling suitcase and a phoned friend. Whitmore used to be like that, before she let her pride destroy her. She leaned forward and pressed her hand against her forehead, taking deep breaths. To stop herself from going even more crazy, she forced herself to ignore the messages that were piling up on her phone and opened her contacts. If James couldn't help her, maybe someone else could. Her eyes fell on Elliot Haynes, a senior administrator with real power in the executive offices. She had met him at business events and even sat next to him at a leadership conference. They weren't friends, but she had always seen him as an ally in the company if anyone could. She hesitated for a split second before pressing the call button. The phone rang 3 times, and he answered it. She blurted, "You have to help me, I need to talk to the board before they won't meet with you," and his voice was flat and distant. "What, Elliot? This isn't about a stupid decision, Whitmore," and the way he said her name, There was no warmth or familiarity between them, there was only distance. He continued in a heavy tone, "This is about Zayden Gray. The second he stepped off that plane, your career was over." She choked on her words, "Listen to me." He cut her off, "You have no idea what kind of man you crossed." The panic in her body grew. "I know exactly who he is, Elliot, that's why I'm calling you now." Elliot said sharply, "You don't." She froze. Elliot let out a slow breath, as if he wasn't sure if he should even be having this conversation. During the conversation, he lowered his voice and asked, "Do you know why Zayden Gray flies commercial instead of on private jets?" She blinked and said, "He's worth billions." Elliot continued, "He owns a fleet of private aircraft and could have pilots on standby for him at any time, but instead he chooses to fly commercial. Do you know why?" She swallowed because he was testing us to see how his passengers are treated and to make sure that every employee in his airline lives up to the standards he set. "Elliot, please give me one more chance to hear what you have to say." His voice was final, there was nothing left to save him. There was a thick, suffocating silence between them before he let out a sharp breath and said, "Listen, I'm only telling you this because we've known each other for a long time. Get ahead of this before it spreads further. Leave quietly, if you try to fight this, if you push back, if you go to the press, I would never if you do." Elliot pressed, ignoring her interruption. She felt a lump in her throat as Elliot said, "I'm sorry, Whitmore, but you need to accept it. This isn't just a job loss." The line went dead, and she stared at her phone, her fingers shaking. She was done with the airline, with first-class service everywhere, and with Zayden Gray. He wasn't just punishing her, he was erasing her. As she put the phone down, her body felt numb, and her mind raced over what Elliot had said. Zayden could have been anywhere, a private jet, a high-profile business lounge away from the chaos of commercial travel, but he chose to be with the passengers. She had spent years thinking she was in charge and had power, but men like him really did have power. What was worse was that he didn't even have to yell or argue. All he had to do was decide, and he had already made his choice. The realization hit her hard. She was no longer Miss Whitmore, first-class cabin supervisor. She was just Whitmore. She was a disgraced former employee standing alone at an airport curb, and no one cared or was coming to save her. There were no second chances, appeals, or favors to call in. She was done. A cold gust of wind hit her face, stinging her skin. The airport and the world moved on, and she had nowhere else to go. Miss Whitmore said as she sat on the bench and stared at the pavement, the weight of everything weighing her down. Her hands, which had been steady and authoritative for 10 years, were now shaking in her lap. People knew she was in charge, but now she was being thrown out. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a new notification. She jumped for joy, hoping that it would be something that would make things better, like a message from an old coworker or someone offering a solution. But when she unlocked the screen, her stomach dropped. Airline statement, internal investigation underway. The airline had already put out a public statement. Her breath came short and shallow as she clicked on the link. The article loaded quickly, and her eyes darted over there. There was an incident on board involving one of our senior flight attendants, and as a result, the airline has started a full internal review. They are committed to maintaining the highest standards of passenger care, and they will take the right action after the investigation is over. There was no name or specifics, but that wasn't needed. Everyone in the industry would know exactly who the statement was about, and if they didn't, the comments below the article made it painfully clear if she got her hands on a unbelievable first-class service should be professional, not abusive. Firing her isn't enough, she should be banned from flying altogether. She clenched her teeth on her phone and saw hundreds of comments. Her shame was now public, and it wasn't stopping there. As she scrolled down, she saw screenshots of the footage that had been leaked. It wasn't from the airline's secure cameras. Instead, passengers had filmed it, taking a grainy, slightly angled picture of what happened. She had lost everything at that very moment: the slap, the stunned silence, the way Amira held her son tighter as if to protect him from her. It was all on video, and it was going viral. She held her breath as she scrolled faster, looking for anything that could stop this, but it was too late. She wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her reputation as well. She had seen public scandals like this happen before: other flight attendants getting into fights, customer service workers making mistakes that got out of hand. Some had gotten better, but she wasn't going to get better from this. Her hands felt numb as she put the phone down next to her. The world around her kept moving: people carrying bags, taxis pulling up, and airport workers talking as they went about their jobs. No one was looking at her yet, but they would soon. People would start recognizing her face and would stare, whisper, and maybe even take out their phones and take a picture. The thought made her heart freeze. She had to do something. With shaking hands, she grabbed her bag and put her phone inside. As she stood, her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk toward the taxi stand. She needed to go somewhere, anywhere, away from the airport, away from the stairs, and away from the walls that felt like they were closing in on her. She got to the curb just as a taxi pulled up, and she yanked open the door and got inside. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, and the driver looked at her in the rearview mirror to see what she was doing. She opened her mouth, but then stopped. For years, the simple answer had been that if she wasn't flying, she was at home waiting for her next assignment. The airport had been her second home, and the airline had been her whole identity. But now she had nowhere to go. Her salary-paid apartment would soon be out of reach, her career, her purpose, and she had no backup plan. She had never planned for failure, because she never thought it would happen to her. "Miss?" the driver asked again, waking her from her thoughts. The driver frowned and put the car into gear, pulling away from the curb. The airport got smaller in the rearview mirror, disappearing into the distance. She had come into the building with everything, but now she was leaving with nothing. The thought made her stomach turn. She was officially a nobody, and there was no going back. The taxi drove through the city streets, but Miss Whitmore barely noticed the changing scenery because the weight of everything was pressing down on her. She held onto her bag tight and stared out the window as the lights flashed by. Her mind was stuck on the slap and the silence, the way Amir had held Cairo as if she were protecting him from a monster, and then Zayden, how he hadn't even raised his voice. His presence alone had been enough to turn the whole flight against her. He hadn't argued with her or threatened her. He had just decided her fate, and everyone else had followed it. That was real power, and she hadn't had it in years. She thought she did because she made rules, made passengers feel like she was in charge, and made decisions without thinking twice. But she was wrong. The real power had always been with those who could end her with a single word, and now Zengray had done just that. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone again. She wasn't even sure why there was no one left to call, no one who could help her, but she needed to see if there was a way out. She checked her email and saw that she had a lot of new messages, some from coworkers, some of whom she barely knew, sending her short texts saying things like, "Good luck, you messed up bad, they're talking about you everywhere." She clenched her jaw and scrolled faster, past the HR emails and social media notifications, until she saw something that almost stopped her heart. Zayden Gray has released a statement. Her fingers shook as she clicked on the link. The article loaded, and there it was. Statement from Zayden Gray, CEO of Skyline Airlines. At Skyline Airlines, we uphold. We are committed to providing the highest level of service and professionalism. The safety and comfort of our passengers are our top priorities, and we do not tolerate any kind of misconduct. As a result of the recent incident involving one of our crew members, strong steps have been taken to make sure that such behavior does not reflect on the values of this airline. We remain committed to giving all travelers an exceptional experience and keeping their trust. He didn't have to say her name because her eraser had already started. There was no talk of suspension, review, or an internal investigation. Zayden Gray had already made it clear that she wasn't coming back, and now every airline in the industry would see this. Every potential employer would know that she had been publicly dumped by one of the most powerful people in aviation. Her name would be talked about in break rooms, and every flight attendant in training would learn from her mistake. This wasn't just about being fired, it was about being. She had spent her whole career working her way up and making sure people respected her and knew she was in charge. Now she was just a story, a cautionary tale. Her fists clenched. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. She thought about going to the press to tell her side of the story, but then she remembered Elliot's warning: if you go to the press, Zayden will make sure you never work in aviation again. Her heart raced. That was exactly what was happening now. He hadn't even had to move. If she fought back, things would only get worse. She took a deep breath and blinked quickly. She had to be smart and think, but what options were left? She looked through her contacts list again, hoping to find someone who might still be on her side. But as she went through the list, doubt crept in. Would they even answer? Would they risk their careers to help her? Probably not. She was tainted now, her breath hitched, and for the first time since getting off the plane, she felt something new had happened, not just panic or fear, but deep, gut-wrenching regret. Because no matter how much she wanted to believe otherwise, she knew the truth. This hadn't happened because Zayden Gray was strong. It happened because she had crossed the line. She had let her ego, impatience, and sense of self-importance blind her. She had hidden a child, and now she was paying the price. Her fingers went limp, and her phone slid onto the seat next to her. The taxi kept moving, and she could see the city lights flashing by. She had no goal, no plan, and no future. She had spent her whole life thinking she was better than everyone else, but now she was below them all, and for the first time in her life she had no way back up. The taxi moved through the city, casting long shadows on Miss Whitmore's face as she looked at her reflection in the window. The woman who had gotten on that plane hours before wasn't the same one who was looking back at her. That woman had been sure of herself and in charge. This woman was lost. She could still hear the echo of her own voice from earlier that day telling passengers to follow procedures and making sure the flight went smoothly. She thought she was in charge, but she had never been. The power she thought she had was an illusion that broke the moment she crossed the one person Zayden Gray had spoken, and now she had lost everything. The taxi driver looked at her in the mirror and asked, "Miss?" She didn't answer right away. He asked, "Where exactly are we going?" in a calm but slightly impatient tone. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out because she didn't know. For years, her life had been a constant routine of flights, layovers, and airline set schedules. She always had somewhere to go or be. Now, for the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go. She reached for her phone, but she already knew there were no messages, no opportunities, no calls offering help, and no one was coming to save her. She could call her family, maybe her sister, but she wouldn't want to admit that she had ruined her career and was in danger of losing everything she had worked so hard for. Her pride wouldn't let her. She could try getting in touch with someone at the airline, maybe a former coworker, but after the leaked video, the public statement, and the many online arguments that were tearing her apart, no one would want to be associated with her number. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to think. She still had some savings, not much, but enough to cover her for a few months if she stuck to her budget. But after that, the aviation industry history was short. Airlines shared information, and a bad reputation could follow someone for years. Zayden Gray's black mark was something she could never get rid of. She thought about the people who had been on that flight. Did they remember her name? Did they care? To them, she was just the disgraced flight attendant who was a cautionary tale and a hot topic for a few days. She clenched her teeth and gripped the phone so tightly that her fingers hurt. This wasn't fair. One mistake was all it took to ruin everything. But deep down, she knew it hadn't been just one mistake. The attitude, the arrogance, the belief that she was untouchable. She had treated passengers like problems instead of people. She had seen herself as a gatekeeper to first-class service instead of someone meant to serve, had been building for years, and today it was all coming together. She had gone too far today and made a mistake that couldn't be fixed. Zayden Gray hadn't just punished her, he had made an example of her. What's worse, he didn't even have to yell, argue, or fight to do it. All he had to do was walk away, and that was the end of her. She took a shaky breath and finally answered the taxi driver's question, "Take me to a hotel," but she said it in a whisper. The driver gave her a small nod and turned down a different street. She stared out the window, her mind blank. She needed time to think. As the city lights flashed by, she knew one thing for sure: her life as she knew it was over. She had spent years thinking she was above the rules, but now she was just another person left behind, and there was nothing she could do about it. If you liked this story, please hit the like button and let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.